Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Dan Dawson Show. I have Dr. Dan back on with us today. What we're going to be discussing is child custody issues. This is a part of his practice that he has a lot of experience in. So for all you people out there with questions, or you just want more insight on how it works, because I know it's a lot of people, this is the man to go to. Hello, Dr. Dan.
Hey there, Dan. How you doing? Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you, too. How's your day going?
Day's been good. Whenever I get here, I consider this the double damn day because that's we get the both of us, which is a plus.
I like that. So you have a history with child custody law, all this wealth of knowledge, and I would really like to tap into that for this episode.
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead.
Well, okay. I guess a good place to start. I think that, my background as a forensic psychologist stems from the fact that when I was going to school, I thought about becoming an attorney. Ended up taking psychology classes, fell in love with that, and thought, well, I could still go on to be an attorney. Ended up getting heavy into the psychology world and found myself able to do the forensic work, which means the application of psychology to the legal world. And forensic, like a forensic accountant applies accounting in the legal world. So forensic psychologists can deal with a whole bunch of different areas, everything from criminal psychology to civil cases, such as a neuropsychologist dealing with damages from a car accident, things like that. In the family law matter, what we're looking at usually is three different areas of practice. One would be therapeutic practices related to helping people going through divorce, people coping with the consequences of the divorce, adjustment afterwards, how to co-parent and raise kids. So the whole therapeutic process. Another domain would be in terms of doing psychological assessments, where what you really do is, what we always do as clinical and forensic psychologists, is to evaluate someone using interview, using information from collateral other sources, people that are familiar with the person, and various psychological tests. Candidly, that testing can give you some clues about issues that might be causing problems. It might be able to help you problem solve things going forward. And sometimes it will give you some idea of why things got the way it did. The third area is in terms of what's considered child custody evaluations. And that would be where there's been a contested dispute over who's going to be a primary parent. Now, you've got some states where there's been joint custody has been the sort of fallback position, but all states operate on the same basic principle of deciding, the court decides, what's in the child or children's best interest. And so some states vary as to how that gets defined and how it gets played out. But when you have people that are saying, hey, I'm the better parent, or I've got these features that make me more qualified, and he or she has huge problems, mental health issues, addictions, domestic violence, whatnot, it can be a very high conflict litigious type of thing. And there's sort of one other little caveat I would add. Besides doing custody evaluations, there's also a specialty field called work product review, which would be where you would look at the work that someone else had done and kind of do a quality control check to see if they did it properly, so that their database is clear, so that the conclusions they've drawn are consistent with the methods, and whether did they do everything they're supposed to do. So my practice in this started out back in 1980, approximately, or 82, working with child custody cases, and had the benefit of working with a firm in part of the north side of Chicago, and started doing, under supervision with another psychologist, child custody evaluations. At that time, it was because I was in Illinois, the emphasis was really on trying to decide who was the better of the two parents. So it was almost like a horse race, and I kind of use that analogy these days. And unfortunately, it misses the boat. Why? Because, it isn't a matter of who's the better parent. It's what are the pluses and minuses that each of the parents bring to a particular family situation. And how can we maximize the best parts of each of those two parents? Sure, they may not be quality able to do what they were able before, in terms of their marital relationship or spousal relationship, or even an unmarried kind of union. They may not be able to relate and do that, but fine, they both have to go about the task of raising a kid together in some fashion, whether it be through what's called parallel parenting, where you do it your way, I do it my way, the kids experience two different households, or through some sort of cooperative co-parenting. And it's all across the board as to how those get played out. So I guess my point with this is probably one of the most difficult areas in all of law, in that you have people that are being seen generally at their worst, trying to portray themselves at their best, trying to underscore and point out deficits on the other side. And oftentimes the child's best interest or children's best interests get lost in the shuffle. And so the court really needs the best information that can be brought forward. And so the problem is that you have an attorney. Let's say you were going through a divorce. You would have an attorney who would be representing your best interests, and hopefully they would do a good job. Your partner would have an attorney likely representing them, unless you went through what was called collaborative divorce, which would be where you might both have attorneys, but instead of deciding how to compete with one another to present the most poignant case, you would try to figure out, how do we find a point of solution? So that's collaborative law. But in this competitive realm, your attorney represents you, the attorney represents the other side. They really try to advocate for that person's position. And the court has to try and figure out, amidst all the stuff that gets said, some of which may not be completely true, what really is factual and what works going forward for a child. So some states have generated what's called a minor's counsel, which is they will appoint an attorney to represent the child's best interest. And that's what they do in California, for instance. Here in Washington, what we do is we have a system under Title 26 called guardian ad litem. And what a guardian ad litem is it's generally an attorney, or it could be a person with a fairly low-level mental health degree, or sometimes even with a doctorate degree in some mental health field, who will be a party to the case, who will evaluate and decide what looks to be a good parenting plan for that child or children. And there's a real distinction, just to clarify and set the stage here, because you may have some questions already brewing. I can see that furrowed brow. The GAL is a person who basically has 19 hours of training, such as an attorney, as I said, or mental health person at, say, a master's level or what have you. 19 hours of specialized training, and then they're cut loose to go do an evaluation. And their work is oftentimes fairly truncated in how much it costs and how much time is allowed. My heart goes out to them, because they're really asked to do a Herculean task, oftentimes with very few tools to do so. And then by contrast, you have what's called the psychological parenting eval. Very expensive process, $11,000, $15,000, $20,000 for a person to go through lots of evaluation with lots of input, psychological testing, records, and so on, and a very comprehensive report to be written. So by comparison, let's say a typical GAL, guardian ad litem report, 20 pages, 30 pages long. When I was doing parenting evals, I've done 450 of those over my 30-year career, and in different jurisdictions, Illinois, California, here in Washington. Those reports got to the point where they were 180 pages double-spaced. So very detailed, lots of information. And the distinction in my mind was not only amount of information, but how do we use that in a problem-solving orientation to try to get the best out of both parents? So I've kind of meandered on quite a bit, but
oh no, it's fine. You're the subject matter expert. This is exactly what I want you to do, because people out here they're getting that knowledge. So what would actually be in these reports?
Well, for instance, if you had a guardian ad litem report, they basically will interview each of the parents. And, if I speak in common terms, we're usually looking at a mom and a dad kind of circumstance, but the same stuff applies whether it's same-sex parents or whether we've got third-party custody cases where, say, a grandparent or an auntie is trying to get primary care over a child or children. So I'm not trying to, slice it a certain way. It applies across the board. But a typical guardian ad litem would interview the various parents or caretakers. They would interview the kids if they're old enough, which opens up a whole nother area that we could talk a little bit about in a minute, because those interviews can be subject to all kinds of sources of error, things that can give you a false impression of what is actually going on. And then they would read some documents. They might make a home visit and go see where people live. And then they write up a fairly short report. Now, the psychological parenting eval is going to look a lot like that, but it usually is going to have more than one interview with each of the parents. Will almost always include a home visit, will include the psychological testing, which might not be done by a guardian ad litem because the guardian ad litem doesn't have the skills or background to do that, because they may send them out to have somebody else do say a domestic violence assessment or anger control assessment or psych assessment. And so that's where that report's going to be much more comprehensive. Quite often they both end up at the same spot in terms of making recommendations for various treatments, different kinds of protective measures. So let's say, for example, you had a case where alcoholism was the concern. That might have been what finally broke the camel's back and why they got divorced. In that case, the court's going to take the position of trying to provide for safety for a child. They might even have supervised visitation, where the parent isn't going to be able to see the kids except for some sort of supervision. It may vary. It may be a lay person, a friend, family member, neighbor, someone else, or it may be a professional monitor, someone you have to pay for that time. And the court's going to keep that control until it appears that it's safe enough to loosen those reins a little bit. So if that addictions case came before, say, a psychological parenting eval, then we would include some degree of addictions assessment, whether it's done by the psychologist, which I've got that background, so I would do that, or they might send that out to someone to get specialized assessment around that. And then we would come up with sort of a multi-step program of how that person might achieve sobriety, go to various treatments, such as AA and other forms of treatment, show that they've established that sobriety through UA, urine analysis tests, sometimes UA with ETG, which is a specialized way to look for byproducts of alcohol. So that way, if they're abstaining, then it should be clean in terms of that. There would be signatures from sponsors and other people at AA. And after a period of time of showing that they were clean and sober, then they would have greater access to more parenting time. That all makes sense? Kind of a step program like that?
No, that makes sense. It's just that's a lot to unpack. See, when I got divorced and I, a single father, raised my daughter on my own. The ex-wife just wanted to go live her life, so she gave me full custody. So I never had to go through any of this.
Yeah.
It was never an issue, and I did not know how much was. Because I've had friends that get divorced and they tell me about it. But to have someone like you to actually walk you through what's actually going on is just, wow, mind-blowing.
Well, what happens, I think your case is a nice one to illustrate and a good place to jump off from. If the parties can agree on their own as to what the parenting plan is going to be, then the court generally accepts that straight out. So in your case, the wife says, you take the child, I'm good, this is fine. But when they can't agree, and that happens, high conflict cases in divorce, contested divorce around child custody takes place in about a little over 10+% of the time. So we're
that's not too bad.
No, it's not a huge number.
It's not too bad.
So where they can't agree, but I can tell you that 10% can get super nasty. You can have high conflict cases where the battle is so important to them that the kids get so damaged in the process. And what we know from the research literature is that the best predictor of negative outcome of children of divorce is exposure to ongoing and high levels of conflict. The goal with most laws in various states is to try to establish some stability for children going forward. Sometimes that gets brought down to kind of a ridiculous level of trying to keep everything the way it was before the divorce. You can't do that in a lot of families because you don't have, say, two breadwinners anymore. You're living in different states. You've got all kinds of factors. So you can't maintain the stability that way. But what you're trying to do is establish a new, stable, adaptive relationship. And so the ones that are high conflict, they ignore all that. They're so intent on going after the other party, and extracting their pound of flesh from that person, that the kids get lost in the shuffle. And the data shows that they really suffer with that.
So it would kind of be like the battle, winning the battle, but losing sight of the mission.
Right, precisely. Yeah, they get so caught up in fighting the fight. Now, in the worst cases like that, we see things like, let's say that might have come out of a situation where there was domestic violence. Now, we could talk a whole talk just about domestic violence, because the common term for it now is intimate partner violence, but so IPV as opposed to DV.
I did not know that.
Yeah, so and that was done to reflect the fact that this can happen in a variety of circumstances. Again, not necessarily a heterosexual couple, could be homosexual or some other sort of relationship. But if you've got elements of domestic violence, which can include everything from financial, where someone's been controlling the person financially, social, where they end up restricting their access to other people, psychological and emotional, where they undermine them, where they engage in gaslighting, which is an expression from an old film. Gaslighting is to kind of make you feel crazy. They do a
See,
lot of
now it's popular again these days. You know that, right?
Oh yeah, gaslighting is real popular. Exactly. But domestic interpersonal violence or intimate partner violence can also include sexual, as well as psychological and physical. So all those domains get into it. And so let's say a person's had that dynamic that caused that relationship to fall apart. Well, you can imagine that quite often that perpetrator, who could be the guy, could be the gal, could reach a point where they continue to try and use that control ongoing and do such things as harass that person, stalk that person, work on alienating the child from having any kind of positive feelings about that person. They could engage in what's called abusive use of conflict, which is a concept here in Washington where they come up with false allegations of sexual abuse or child abuse, all kinds of things to just undermine that person. And eventually they could even do this and play it out so that the financial cost of going to court has been so high that they just wear the person out. So that's a real nasty kind of high conflict, ongoing conflict case. And we see those things. And my heart goes out to the judges who see these on a daily basis, because they have to toughen themselves up and learn how to navigate through that, which is why many superior court judges that have come in, say, from criminal law, they get into family law here in Washington, and a lot of them, after a couple of years on the family law bench, they're eager to get off.
They get burnt out.
They do.
It makes sense, yeah.
But I'll make one quick comment alternative to that, though. California, where I've practiced, actually has a family law system where the judges quite often stay there for a long, long time. So I'm aware of here in Washington, we have some commissioners, say in Pierce County. Some of those commissioners have handled family law matters for years and have gotten really good at it. They've learned how to sift through the shenanigans that are being played by some of the attorneys and by the clients. They've learned how to understand what's going on and do well. In California, much the same thing, where you've had family court judges that have stayed on long enough to actually see a case come back a few times and to nurture it along. Whereas Washington prefers to get the job done, get a final parenting plan, and move on. So there's a lot of different models across the country that also color how complicated this gets.
Wow, wow, it's a lot to unpack in this. And like I said, I've had friends go through where they get falsely accused of child abuse and stuff. Like you were saying, that alienating with the domestic violence, alienating people from their friends. I tell you what, next time the old lady says, "No, you can't go to the barber, Dr. Dan," I'm calling 911.
There you go. Exactly. Well, this alienation theme is one we could talk a little bit about. Quite some time ago, a guy named Richard Gardner, who's passed on a few years back, came up with a concept called parental alienation syndrome. And the long and the short of it was people who the parent was causing the child to have a unrealistic, hostile, negative view of the other parent, to the point that they wanted nothing to do with the other parent. The child would engage in what's called visitation resistance. They didn't want to go. And they would come up with statements that were so outlandish about how horrible that other person was that they weren't grounded in reality. Trying to evaluate that was difficult. And unfortunately, Dr. Gardner was an MD, so he used a medical model rather than a scientific model to develop the concept of the syndrome. And the syndrome was grossly challenged by a lot of people in the field, and perhaps rightly so. But what came out of that was a different concept called the alienated child, where instead of starting with a parent doing the alienation, you started to look for what did a child look to be alienated from a parent. And that would be where you would start to figure out, well, why might they engage in that behavior? What is it about it that keeps them from wanting to spend time with the other parent? So what you discover is there could be a bunch of things. There could be a parent who's undermining, as we said, and that would be kind of like parental alienation. You could have a parent who's really a bad person in many ways. I'm using that to gloss over a lot of areas, but a person who's nasty, who's criminal, who's drug abuse, who's unable to give nurturance to a kid, who lacks parenting skills, who's crazy in many ways. And some of those things could in fact lead that child to be estranged, so they didn't want to go for sort of a legitimate reason. And then getting closer to more normal, you might have what's called a loyalty bind, where a child doesn't know which side they really want to be involved with. Quite often that child is anxious and sort of tries to say whatever side wants to hear. Kind of like some of our politicians seem to do as they go from one place to the next.
Bounce
Bad
back and forth.
example, but
But I
that's a
went through my
different thing.
divorce. That was actually the one of the things was I had to have that talk with my daughter because she was. I remember the first time she went to Los Angeles to visit her mother. As you know, I live in Lakewood, Washington. So she goes down to Los Angeles to visit her mother. She's like, "Oh, I don't know how you're gonna feel about it," and I'm like, "Go, have fun." She's like, "Well, I might stay for the summer." I'm like, "Stay for the summer. Enjoy yourself. Have fun. It's
Yeah.
fine. I'll be here when you get back." Then I proceeded to party for a couple of months. So
Sometimes, that's a funny thing. A lot of parents that end up getting the every other weekend or week on, week off, they discover after a while that that time without the child is actually a nice break to be a whole person again in some ways. So you
you
got
can
a
go out
chance
and
to
do
do that.
things.
Yeah, exactly. And that's interesting. When you talk about your daughter doing it in that way, what we'll see sometimes is that kids may come back. Let's say your daughter went down there and came back, and for whatever reason, she felt she needed to say all kinds of nasty things about mom. Oh, mom wasn't supervising me, whatever it might be. And things that would be done that would try to show her allegiance to you and her rejection of mom. And so we'll hear stories like that. And sometimes I draw the analogy that it's kind of like cats who are outdoor cats will show up at your front porch, oftentimes a little dead bird or a dead mouse. And it's their way of saying, I'm a part of the pride, I'm a part of the family, here is my gift and my contribution, please accept me. And so you'll see kids will come back with false allegations because they feel a need to offer that up so that they'll feel accepted and get the strokes from that person they're giving that to. And then on that analogy, there was one step closer. So we've got the alienation, the estrangement, this loyalty conflict and loyalty bind. And then you might just have kind of an alignment where a child feels more closely aligned with one parent versus the other through identification processes, temperament, they just feel more comfortable with that person. And that's cool. So when we get into these cases, we have to analyze all that stuff and sift through what the child's actually telling us, what might be going on beyond the picture, and try and get some clues.
Well, yeah, and that's actually one of the things because the first time when my daughter came back, that was her thing for driving home from the airport. It's like, I don't like going down there and blah blah. I'm like, she's your mother. Go down there and have fun. It's like, and, after a while, it's like, well, did you have fun? She's like, yeah, we did this and we did that. It's like that stuff sounds exciting. You don't sound exciting saying it. And so after a while, she kind of loosened up about it. But it
Yeah.
was it was really a matter of me letting her know it's okay to go down there and have fun. Please do.
Well, she felt responsible for your feelings, and kids will do that because they read their environment and they try to respond according to that. So that makes perfect sense why that might happen. So we've touched upon a couple of things. We touched upon domestic violence. Allegations can be true, it could be false. High conflict kinds of issues, alienation. I mentioned a little bit about how interviewing the kids can be troubled. One of the things that comes up in the most complicated, so the most complicated cases in family law are relocation cases, cases of domestic violence, addictions, and alienation. Those are probably the main kinds of issues where it's really tough to figure out what's the best thing to do and what treatments and what interventions need to take place to get the most out of the circumstance for everybody. So when we're dealing with, we mentioned a couple of those with the alienation, the domestic violence. The one thing which I didn't get to was how false allegations of sexual abuse can come up. Now, this might happen in the course of the divorce. It might happen years later. So what one spot in the road that things get difficult is, let's say you get through your divorce process, you've got your parenting plan, and suddenly dad gets involved with another person. That new person enters the picture, and what looks stable gets shaken up, and all of a sudden, mom is really watching what's going on. And if she had her own history of trauma, she may be watching for clues about things that might look a little bit like her daughter, in this case, would be worried about what that daughter might have experienced. And so if it was a young child coming back, young kids are more prone to making statements that are inarticulate, not necessarily accurate, sometimes influenced by fantasy, and how a parent responds to that can amplify the statement, and suddenly you have a three-ring circus. You have an allegation of child sexual abuse with a young child, so you have a criminal case that's gotten started, you have the police checking it out, you have Child Protective Services checking it out, so there's a dependency case that's on hold, and a family law matter. And you find out that by the time that the kid gets interviewed by someone who has some real interviewing skills, that they've been talked to about this case or issue some dozen times, which means there's 12 times before they get to a forensic interview where all kinds of misinformation can get incorporated into it. And while we have strong advocates, and I'm a strong advocate for child safety and child protection. I was a member of the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children for many years. I've done a lot of work around abuse, and we want to protect kids, but we also need to keep an open mind that things they say may not always be completely accurate, and how we ask may influence what we get. And boy, you want to open a can of worms that's controversial, that one will do it, with huge stakes.
Oh, well, my the ex-wife sister, I'll never forget. We came back from Germany. My daughter was born in Germany. And we come back from Germany, and we stopped in Texas. We drove on up here to Fort Lewis, stopped in LA for a week. And it was really strange because we're sitting out at the time. My daughter was 6, 8 months old, right? And her sister, my ex-wife's sister, asked me something. She goes, well, what would you do if your dad messed with your daughter? And my answer was clear and simple. Like, I'd kill him. It's not even much of a decision. So as we're driving from Los Angeles here, I'm talking to the now ex-wife. I'm like, what the hell was that? Because, that's a pretty, like a 16, 18-hour drive. I'm like, what the hell was that? And so she told me the story of how her sister had went through that trauma.
Right.
And it's like, okay, so now I get where that question came from.
Yeah.
So when we got divorced, that was always one of the big things. It's like, who's around my niece? Like, nobody.
Yeah, that kind of issue is the flip side of it too. So think of it this way. Let's say you were in the circumstance where you were very protective of your daughter, and your daughter was going down to California to the ex-wife, and you find out that the ex-wife's gotten involved with some shady characters, somebody who maybe had some kind of criminal history, and you feel super protective. And so you start interviewing your child about all kinds of stuff. Well, your interview could influence what the child says, and they may say something that isn't true, or they may be so scared about the whole process that they don't say anything for a long, long time. So both extremes can happen. So you may get false statements, or you may get no statement about something that should have been talked about. So everybody gets on edge. And so the mystery and the challenge for the psychological evaluator, and think of this, if you're a guardian ad litem and you only have, say, 10 hours to invest in trying to figure this stuff out without a full psychological background to do it, versus a person who's PhD who's going to spend 45 or 50 hours to try and figure it out, who even then may be limited with what tools we have to try to figure out what's really going on and how do we provide protection for a child while at the same time maximizing the best they can get from each of their parents. Along those lines, you mentioned something about, you wanted your daughter to go have fun with mom. let's take the case where the other parent's just really a no good person. That's my easiest way to lump a whole bunch of stuff together. They're a 5-time DUI alcoholic. They're a rageaholic. They're just a nasty grandma on wheels. And so the kid goes to visit that parent. Is there anything that can come out of that? Is there any way that the child can be protected from being exposed to that? Well, it gets complicated, but in some ways, unless there's supervised visitation, and that oftentimes only lasts for so long, the kids are going to have some degree of exposure. And so even if they're exposed to a bad person in that sense, can they get anything out of it? Well, I can tell you from experience with cases and with stepdaughters that I have, that they learn what they don't want to know about. They learn the kind of person they don't want to relate to. Now, granted, they carry the experience with them, but they've learned from those tough experiences. So to the extent we can protect, I'd be very supportive of that. And to the extent we can't, then we try to help them know how to manage for themselves and how to get the benefit of what they've learned from that tough experience.
Oh, wow. That is a good way to put it, because, I mean, even from my childhood, there are examples of, I have uncles that I love, aunts that I love, but they have certain characteristics like I don't want anything to do with that.
Right.
And even now at almost 50, it affects my life. It's like, I don't want that characteristic. So you tend to stay away from it. So that's a pretty good point.
Well, the point being that you can gain something even from a bad experience.
Oh, very, very true.
Yeah.
Very, very true.
So this is an area I mentioned. I've done 450 of these full psychological parenting evals, and I stopped doing that a couple of years ago because there was just a point where I was just tired of doing all that, and I had other things to do in terms of trying to teach. I've done a lot of training for people in seminars and things at professional conferences, and we've set up a statewide organization here, the Washington chapter of the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts, which was doing annual conventions and training for guardian ad litem, for judges and attorneys on how to do a better job. So I started putting more emphasis on the education. And then I've been doing also at this point, most of my work is either psych assessment, which might help the guardian ad litem, or it's work product review. So let's say you had a guardian ad litem or a psychologist that did an evaluation in your case, and you don't think they got it right. I will take a look at it, and I will look at it methodologically, scientifically, and logically, and I don't have an axe to grind, and I can tell you straight, okay, they should have done this, they should have done that, this was okay. It's not perfect, but it still works. Kind of like having somebody check out a house you want to buy and determine that it's not perfect, but you know, it's going to be okay. And quite often when I give feedback like that, they decide to settle the case. They don't go on with the battle in various ways. If we find that there's key issues that were big problems, then my job is to help the court understand this didn't rise to the level that was expected for a quality product. So, Your Honor, you're not getting the good data that you need to be able to make the decision. So maybe you send it back to get new data brought forward. Maybe you find other solutions. So that's a whole nother interesting domain.
Oh, wow. I mean, just the level of good judgment a person would have to do what you do is astounding.
It's been an interesting journey.
All right, Dr. Dan, thank you for this interview. Of course, we'll continue. We'll have more episodes. So for the audience out there, if there's anything psych-related you want to know about, please hit me up in the comment sections. I'll make sure Dr. Dan talks about it. Thank you once again, Dr. Dan.
Always a pleasure, Handsome Dan.